He thought he'd found a dying horse in the snow, until he brushed back her mane and saw the mark that should have been impossible. On a silent winter morning in Wyoming, Ethan Hale believed he was simply helping a starving horse survive one more hour. But when he brushed aside her frozen mane, a strange symbol appeared, one that hadn't been seen in more than 12 years. That was the moment he realized this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a mystery that would reopen wounds, reunite lives, and lead him to a truth no one was ready for. The storm had passed hours earlier, but winter still clung stubbornly to the wide Wyoming plains as Ethan Hale drove his old pickup across the frozen field. Dawn crept slow and pale over the foothills, turning every blade of frost-tipped grass into a needle of silver light. Ethan's breath fogged the inside of the windshield, and he rubbed it with the back of his glove. Another reminder that the heater was dying, like most things on his ranch. He told himself he needed to look into new ranch insurance before the next blizzard, but the thought drifted away as soon as he stepped out of the truck. The world was silent. Not peaceful, just silent in the way winter often was, as if sound itself had frozen in midair. Ethan trudged toward the north fence line to check the section he'd patched together after last night's winds. Snow cracked beneath his boots. The horizon stretched wide and empty, the kind of emptiness that could swallow a man whole. He'd lived alone here for years, working metal by day, tending cattle by necessity, surviving more out of habit than ambition. Some days, the loneliness felt like another winter. Long, relentless, impossible to reason with. He was halfway to the fence when he saw it. A shape, dark, unmoving, stood at the far edge of the pasture, half hidden behind a drift of hardened snow. Ethan stopped. The shape didn't belong there. It wasn't a cow, wasn't a fallen branch, and wasn't the shadow of a rock. It was taller, narrower, fragile in a way that made something inside him tighten. He moved closer, each step slow and careful. When he reached the drift, the wind shifted, pushing the last veil of snow aside, and the breath in Ethan's lungs stilled. It was a horse, or what was left of one. The animal stood rigid, ribs stark beneath a dull sorrel coat that looked more like wet burlap than living fur. Its legs trembled, barely holding its weight. The tail hung limp, coated with ice. But the eyes, sunken, exhausted, framed by hollows carved by months of hunger, still searched the air as if waiting for someone. "Hey," Ethan whispered, not wanting to startle it, though he doubted anything could startle a creature this close to collapse. "Easy there. Easy." The horse didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice him at first. Only when he stepped directly into its line of sight did the animal lift its head an inch, the motion stiff and painful. A puff of cold air escaped its nostrils, barely visible. Ethan saw the lines of frost clinging to its whiskers, tiny crystals glittering in the weak light. "Where'd you come from?" he murmured. The horse blinked slowly, and in that blink Ethan saw a flicker, small but unmistakable, of life refusing to surrender. He'd seen that look before in animals he'd tried to save, and in people who had lost too much. It was the look of something battered, but not yet broken. He stepped closer, letting the horse smell him. When it didn't shy away, he reached for its neck. The coat was coarse, tangled, stiff with cold. His fingers brushed beneath the heavy curtain of matted mane, and something caught the edge of his glove. A ridge, a raised mark, a burn. Ethan pushed the mane aside. There, against the pale winter light, lay a symbol burned into the horse's skin. Not a ranch brand he recognized, not the mark of any Wyoming operation he'd ever traded stock with. It was curved, almost artistic, like an emblem meant to carry meaning, not ownership. A crescent intersected by two clean lines, weathered with time, but still deeply etched. A strange chill went through Ethan, and it had nothing to do with the cold. "That's not from around here," he said softly, tracing the edges without touching them. The horse swayed, legs buckling. Ethan caught its shoulder on instinct, steadying it. "Okay, that's enough standing. Let's get you out of this wind." He didn't know how the animal had wandered onto his land or how long it had been standing alone in the storm. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was keeping it alive for another hour, another day. Everything else could wait. Ethan grabbed the frayed lead rope he kept looped on his belt. When he slipped it around the horse's neck, the animal didn't resist. It lowered its head, as if surrendering not to him, but to the small mercy of being guided. The walk back to the barn was slow, painfully slow. Every few steps, the horse paused, chest rising and falling with effort. Ethan stayed beside it, speaking in a voice barely above the wind, letting it borrow whatever strength he could offer. The moment they stepped into the shelter of the old wooden barn, the horse collapsed to its knees before struggling back upright, stubborn, refusing to go down fully. Ethan closed the door behind them, shutting out the wind. His breath mingled with the horse's ragged breathing. He brought a bucket of warm water, watching as the animal sniffed it, but drank only a mouthful. Starvation had shrunk its stomach to the size of a clenched fist. Feeding it wrong now could kill it. "I'll go slow," Ethan promised, more to himself than to the horse. He placed a hand gently on its neck again. The symbol was hidden beneath the mane once more, but Ethan could still feel the weight of it in the air, like a secret waiting for the right moment to uncoil. A starving horse wandering onto his land was strange enough, but a starving horse carrying a symbol like that was something else entirely. And although Ethan didn't know it yet, this winter morning, this quiet moment in a drafty barn, was the beginning of a story that would reopen doors long sealed shut, stir ghosts that had been sleeping for over a decade, and bind him to a creature whose past was about to collide violently with his own. Outside, the wind howled along the plains, brushing against the barn like a warning. Inside, Ethan knelt beside the trembling sorrel mare and whispered, "You're safe for now. We'll figure this out. Together." The barn was still breathing with the night's cold when Ethan returned with a lantern in one hand and a blanket in the other. The sorrel mare stood exactly where he had left her, as if afraid that any movement might shatter whatever thin thread of strength she still possessed. Her head drooped low, eyes half closed. But there was a flicker, a stubborn ember, glowing behind the exhaustion. He set the lantern on a hook and let its gold light spill gently across the stall. The mare's coat caught the warmth unevenly, revealing patches of dullness and mats that spoke of months, maybe years, without proper care. "Let's take a better look at you," Ethan murmured, stepping closer with the slow, steady gait of a man used to moving around wounded animals. He touched her shoulder. She flinched, barely, but enough for him to feel the shock ripple through her body. Not fear, exactly. More like anticipation of pain. Ethan waited until her breathing steadied before reaching up to push back the thick curtain of her mane. His fingers worked carefully through knots and clumps of dirt, each strand a quiet testimony to something she had endured alone. Then the symbol appeared again. Not the half glimpse he'd caught out in the field. but the full imprint, a crescent shape intersected by two diagonal strokes, weathered and pale against her skin. The edges were uneven, as though whoever burned it into her flesh had not cared whether it healed cleanly. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. The mark looked nothing like the ranch brands common in Wyoming, Utah, or the northern Colorado corridor. It wasn't a letter, not a number, not an identifier at all. More like a crest, or a seal. And seals, he knew, meant ownership of a different sort. He stepped back, studying her from a small distance. The mare shifted her weight, adjusting her stance to ease the strain on her front legs. She wasn't simply thin. She was starved, dehydrated, and carrying the invisible weight of something that had broken long before the winter storm found her. "You didn't wander here by accident," Ethan whispered. "Someone left you, or someone lost you." The mare's ears flicked weakly at his voice. She wasn't young. He could see the years etched into the angles of her frame. But age wasn't the enemy here. Neglect was. Ethan reached for the blanket and spread it over her back, tucking it gently around her sides to trap what warmth her failing body still produced. She leaned into the touch. Not much. Just enough that he noticed. From the corner of the barn, his phone buzzed. It was the veterinarian, Dr. Rowan, returning his earlier call. "How bad is she?" Her voice crackled through the speaker. "Bad," Ethan answered. "Body score maybe 2 at most. She's freezing. Not much fat left. And there's a mark on her neck I don't recognize." "A brand?" "Not exactly. Looks intentional, but not like any cattle or horse brand I've seen." There was a pause on the line, one of those pauses that carried more weight than words. "Send me a picture when you can," Rowan said. "Go slow with food. Electrolytes if she'll take them. Don't force anything. I'll be there within the hour." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and crossed the stall again. The mare had lowered her head almost to the straw, eyelids fluttering. Ethan sat on the edge of the wooden rail and said softly, "Stay with me a little longer." He didn't know why he spoke, as though she could understand. But the moment the words left his mouth, something changed. Her ears shifted. She inhaled through her nose, a thin, fragile breath that stirred the straw beneath her hooves. It was an effortful movement, one that cost her more than it should have. Yet she made it. Ethan prepared a small pail of warm water mixed with electrolytes, just enough to moisten her throat without shocking her system. He brought it to her, holding it steady so she didn't need to lower her head further. She lapped a few sips, slow and cautious. It wasn't much, but it was something. An interest in surviving, however faint. Outside the barn, the sky brightened into a bleak winter morning, the kind that stretched endless and pale over Wyoming's long ridges. The sun rose without warmth, spreading only a cold clarity across the ranch. Ethan watched dust motes drift in the lantern light, settling on the mare's tangled mane like soft confetti. He wondered what roads she had taken to end up here, what fences she had crossed, what storms she had endured, what hands had once held her reins, hands that had also burned that symbol into her. He brushed the mane aside once more. The mark bothered him in a way he couldn't quite name. Not fear, not suspicion. Something heavier. Something that touched his memory of long-ago stories. Ranchers marking horses for reasons that had nothing to do with breeding or ownership. Marks meant to signify identity, legacy, or debt. He made a mental note to search for the symbol online later, maybe through a livestock registry or specialty forum. But for now, the priority was keeping the mare upright. "Let's get you something to stand on," he said. He laid down fresh straw and tightened the blanket again. The mare shifted her weight onto her right hind leg, and for the first time since he'd found her, she exhaled in a way that sounded almost relieved. Ethan didn't smile. He wasn't the smiling type, but he felt a small, grounding warmth settle somewhere beneath his ribs. "You're a fighter," he whispered. Her eyes half opened, and she looked directly at him. Not past him, not through him, at him. And something in that gaze, faint but steady, told him she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The barn door creaked as the wind pushed against it. Ethan stood, adjusting his coat as the cold leaked in. Before stepping out, he paused and looked back at the mare. He didn't know her name, but he knew he would. Because whatever story she carried, whatever mystery lived beneath that symbol, it had found him for a reason. And he wasn't the kind of man who walked away from a story still breathing. "I'll be right here," he said. "You're not alone anymore." Outside, the wind carried his words into the pale morning. Inside the stall, the mare lifted her head a fraction, as if acknowledging a promise neither of them fully understood yet, but both were willing to cling to. And that was enough. The forge had always been Ethan Hale's refuge, a place where noise drowned memory, where sparks filled the silence that life left behind. That morning, though, the clang of steel against the anvil sounded different. Softer somehow. Hesitant, like his own thoughts. The sorrel mare was resting in the adjacent stall, only a thin wooden wall separating the warmth of the forge from her trembling presence. Ethan worked slowly, reshaping a bent hinge he needed for the south gate, but his attention drifted again and again to the faint rhythm of her breath. It came unevenly, sometimes catching mid-exhale, as though the simple act of living demanded more strength than she had left. When the metal finally cooled, he set it aside and stepped into the stall. The mare lifted her head at the sound of his boots, just enough to acknowledge him. Her eyes, hollow the night before, had gained a fragile glow, a spark that hadn't been there when he'd found her in the snow. Ethan didn't speak right away. He knelt, letting her see him at eye level. Animals knew the difference between a man approaching with purpose and a man approaching with kindness. Today, he was the latter. "Morning," he said softly. Her ears twitched forward, a small gesture, but unmistakably aware. Ethan checked the blanket he'd draped over her. The fabric had slipped along her spine, exposing the ridges of her vertebrae, sharp as stones beneath worn cloth. He secured it again and reached for the small bucket he'd prepared. Warm water with electrolytes, a careful balance that Dr. Rowan had insisted would keep her from going into shock. When he brought the bucket close, the mare studied it warily before taking cautious sips. Each swallow was slow, tentative, as if she was relearning how to trust nourishment. "You're fighting," Ethan murmured. "That's good. Keep at it." His voice carried easily in the forge, a low, steady sound absorbed by the wood beams above. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept over the plains, rattling the barn door like a reminder that the world out there was harsher than anything inside this stall. Ethan checked her hooves next. He didn't need a vet's eye to see what months of neglect had done. Cracks, uneven wear, the faint trace of old infections. But she allowed him to lift each hoof in turn, as though she remembered the ritual and found comfort in its familiarity. When he finished, he rested a hand against her neck. Heat pulsed faintly beneath the blanket. The mark lay hidden under her mane, but its weight lingered in the back of his mind like an unanswered question. He rose, grabbed hay from the loft, and returned with a handful. Not too much, Feeding her too quickly could kill her. He placed it on the ground near her front hooves. She leaned down, sniffed the hay as if it were something she had once known intimately, but now approached with caution. After a moment, she began to eat. Slowly, carefully. Ethan watched the motion, feeling a quiet sense of relief settle over him like dust. The mare's breaths grew steadier between each bite, as though the simple act of eating tethered her back to the world. "Good girl," he whispered. She paused to look at him. Really look. Her gaze was still dulled by exhaustion, but behind it was something unmistakably alive. Something that felt like gratitude. Ethan wasn't a man who believed easily in signs or fate, but it struck him then that maybe the storm hadn't blown her onto his land by accident. Maybe she'd been moving toward something. Or someone. A sharp gust of wind slammed against the barn door. The mare startled, stepping sideways with a weak but instinctive jerk. Ethan moved to steady her, hands gentle against her shoulder. The moment she felt his touch, her breathing slowed again. "That's it," he murmured. "I've got you." The forge hissed as the fire settled. The whole barn seemed to exhale with it, settling into a rare, fragile stillness. In that quiet, Ethan realized how long it had been since he'd allowed another living thing this close. How long since he'd felt needed in a way that mattered beyond chores and cattle and long, empty winters. He stood and walked back to the forge. Sparks rose as he stoked the coals, casting warm flickers onto the mare's coat through the open stall door. She watched him, her head barely lifted, as though the sound of steel meeting anvil was familiar. An echo from a time before neglect and cold nights. Minutes drifted by in a rhythm of hammer strokes and quiet breathing until the mare shifted again, the soft rustle of her blanket pulling Ethan's attention. She stepped forward, just once, toward the forge opening, her ears tilted toward the ringing steel. "You like the sound?" he asked. She blinked slowly, and for the first time he saw a faint curiosity in her posture. Something not bound by survival alone. Ethan returned to the stall, removed a few stubborn tangles from her mane, and checked for signs of fever. She leaned into the touch, a gesture that, in another horse, might have seemed trivial. But in her, it was an act of trust. A promise. "You're not giving up," he whispered. "And I'm not either." His phone buzzed again. Dr. Rowan's truck rumbling toward the ranch. Her arrival would bring answers, or at least steps forward. But Ethan sensed something deeper. The symbol on the mare's neck wasn't going to be a simple puzzle. It felt older than that, heavier, as if it carried a story too big for one winter morning. Before leaving the stall, Ethan brushed his hand along her cheek. The mare closed her eyes briefly, letting herself rest against his touch. Outside, the wind quieted, as though listening. Inside, the mare breathed in, slowly, deliberately. And for the first time since he found her, she exhaled, without trembling. Dr. Rowan arrived just as the pale afternoon light stretched across the Wyoming plains, the kind of thin, washed-out light that made every building look older and every fence post look tired. Her truck crunched over the frozen gravel before stopping near the barn. Ethan stepped out to meet her, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. She swung down from the driver's seat with the steady confidence of someone who had walked into more barns than grocery stores in her lifetime. "Where is she?" Rowan asked, her tone clipped but not unkind. "In the forge stall," Ethan said. "Barely standing this morning. Drinking a little now." That earned a slight nod from Rowan, approval mixed with caution. Inside the barn, the mare lifted her head as they approached. Rowan paused at the doorway, studying her with the slow, deliberate gaze of a veteran who had learned to measure life by breathing patterns and small movements. She stepped closer, setting down her bag. "Let's see what you've been through," she murmured. Echo didn't shy away when Rowan touched her neck. She stood still as gloved hands moved along her ribs, pressed gently at her jaw, checked her gums for blood flow. Rowan frowned at the hollow beneath the mare's eyes, the tightness in her flank. "Severe malnutrition. She's been without proper food for weeks, maybe longer. You said she drank?" "A few sips," Ethan answered. "That's good, but this will take time. Slow feeding. Close monitoring." Her voice carried a clinical certainty, but there was something softer beneath it, something Ethan rarely saw from her during livestock emergencies. It wasn't pity, more a quiet respect for any creature that had lived long enough to reach help. Rowan pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and lifted the mare's mane. The symbol revealed itself under the beam, sharp, distinct, and unmistakably intentional. "That," she said, "isn't a standard brand. Not from around here." "I figured as much," Ethan replied. "It doesn't match any Wyoming registry." She traced the air above the mark, avoiding direct contact. "It's older than it looks. Maybe regional or private. This isn't ranch work. Someone marked her for identity, not livestock classification, like a crest." Ethan leaned against the stall gate. "Any idea who would use something like that?" Rowan shook her head. "Not around here. I'll ask around. Maybe someone in Colorado or down near the Utah line. Could be tied to an old training facility. I've seen strange marks used by certain breeders, usually the kind who believe a symbol gives a horse some kind of prestige." Ethan watched the mare. She flicked her ears at Rowan's voice, alert despite exhaustion. "So she didn't just get lost," he said. "No," Rowan replied. "She belonged to someone once, someone who wanted her to be recognized. The question is why she's standing here now, half-starved and alone." A gust of wind rattled the barn door. Echo tensed, but didn't move. Rowan continued her exam, checking for parasites, old injuries, and signs of past pregnancies. When she finished, she stepped back with a sigh. "She's tough," Rowan said. "Most wouldn't have survived a storm like last night, so whatever she's been through, she had a reason to keep going." Ethan felt those words more deeply than he expected. He glanced at the mare's flank, rising and falling, struggling yet steady. "I'll make sure she keeps going," he said quietly. Rowan nodded again, but there was something behind her expression, something that made Ethan straighten. "You said you have internet at home?" she asked. "Slow, but yes. Search for that mark. Someone will know it. A symbol like this doesn't vanish, and if she wandered here from out of state, someone might be looking for her, even if they stopped years ago." Ethan didn't answer. He looked again at the mare, at the faint tremor in her legs, the new steadiness in her eyes. Whoever had owned her hadn't fed her, hadn't sheltered her, hadn't kept her safe. Whatever home she'd had before, she had walked away from it or been forced from it. He wasn't sure he wanted to return her to anyone who had let her reach this state. Rowan finished packing her tools. "I'll come back tomorrow. Keep her drinking. Offer hay only in handfuls." Then she turned to look at him directly. "And Ethan, whatever you find out about that symbol, be ready. Horses don't end up like this unless someone fails them, or betrays them." She left, her truck disappearing into the gray light as the wind picked up again. Ethan lingered in the doorway of the forge, watching Echo shift her weight and settle into the straw. Her breathing was steadier now. Not strong, but steady. He returned inside, took a stool from the corner, and sat near the stall. The mare blinked at him, eyes soft but searching. Ethan rested his elbows on his knees, letting the warmth of the forge drift over them both. "You're here now," he said. "Whatever storm you came through, it's behind you." But even as he spoke, he felt the truth hovering like a shadow. Storms leave things behind. Marks, scars, stories buried beneath dust and silence. And some storms didn't end just because the snow stopped falling. He reached out and brushed a strand of her mane aside. The symbol was hidden now, lost in the shadow of her neck. But Ethan still saw it in his mind. Clear, deliberate, haunting. "I'll figure out where you're from," he whispered, "and why you had to find me." The mare lowered her head, a small surrender to exhaustion. Ethan stayed seated beside her, listening to the slow cadence of her breath. The forge crackled behind him, steel cooling on the anvil like a heartbeat settling after a long run. Outside, the plains stretched into a dim horizon, the winter sky shifting toward dusk. The world felt wide and fragile all at once. Inside, a man and a wounded horse shared a silence that was not empty, but full of things unspoken, things unknown, and a beginning neither of them fully understood yet. Ethan waited until dusk settled fully over the Wyoming plains, before sitting down at his old kitchen table, with the slow, stubborn internet connection he depended on more than he liked to admit. The house creaked with familiar loneliness, the kind that came from years of quiet dinners and nights spent fixing metal rather than speaking to another soul. He typed in a description of the symbol he'd found beneath the mare's tangled mane. Crescent intersected by 2 strokes, equine branding, possible crest, and waited as the page loaded one line at a time. Most results were useless. Some were amateur discussions about symbolic brands, others vague mentions of training facilities across the Rocky Mountain corridor. But one small forum post, nearly 12 years old, caught his attention. The thread title read, "Echo Ridge Arena. Anyone remember the fielding horses?" A dozen replies followed. Names, fragments. Someone mentioned a girl who died young. Someone else said the facility shut down after the tragedy, whatever that meant. And in the middle of the thread, almost buried, was a grainy photograph. A sorrel mare, head lifted proudly beneath a bright summer sun. Same coloring, same blaze, same delicate frame. On her neck, faint but visible, was the same crescent symbol. Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not excitement, but a kind of recognition. Not of the horse, but of the weight the symbol carried. He didn't know the mare's story yet, but he knew she had one. And he knew it didn't end here in Wyoming. He clicked on the username of the person who had posted the photo. M. Fielding. The account was no longer active, but a line in one of the comments included an email address. He hesitated, before writing anything. This wasn't a missing pet poster. This was a horse that had nearly died in his field. An animal whose condition suggested long-term neglect or abandonment. Whoever once owned her had failed her in ways Ethan had seen too many times in livestock rescues. Still, he typed a message. Simple. Honest. "I believe I found a horse connected to Echo Ridge Arena. If you are the person from the forums, please contact me." He hit send, unsure what he hoped for. The next morning, the reply came. Not from email, but from a phone call. The number was unfamiliar. Colorado area code. Ethan answered on the 3rd ring. Is this Ethan Hale? A rough, quiet voice asked. Yes. This is Marcus Fielding. I got your message. The man inhaled sharply, as if fighting something inside himself. You said you found a horse. With the crest. Ethan kept his voice steady. A sorrel mare. Starved nearly to death. Found her here after the blizzard. Silence. Not the kind of silence that meant hesitation, but the kind that came from a man standing at the edge of a memory too steep to look down into. Does she still have the mark? Marcus asked. Yes, Ethan said softly. Another long breath on the other end. Then barely more than a whisper. I think that's Echo. The name settled into the space between them like dust. Echo. Not a label. A memory. A person, almost. Something cherished. Ethan felt the weight of it immediately. You knew her? Another silence. Then, she was my sister's horse. There was no emotion in the sentence, but the emptiness carried its own grief. What happened to her? Ethan asked. My sister? Marcus said. Then, after a shaky breath, she died 12 years ago. Ethan tightened his grip on the phone. I'm sorry. So was everyone, Marcus said quietly. And then the horses disappeared. Echo most of all. His voice had grown distant, as though he were looking at something only he could see. Ethan didn't interrupt. The arena closed, Marcus continued. My parents lost everything. I left Colorado, tried to build a life somewhere else. But Echo, another pause, fractured this time. She was the last piece of my sister. When she vanished, it felt like losing her twice. Ethan swallowed hard. He looked toward the barn window, where morning light filtered through dust and cold air. The mare was resting. Alive. Breathing. She's here, he said gently. She's weak, but she's here. A soft, unsteady exhale came through the phone. I need to come. I need to see her. You can, Ethan said. Whenever you're ready. I'll drive tonight, Marcus whispered. I don't want to waste another 12 years wondering. When the call ended, Ethan stood alone in the kitchen as the wind swept against the house. Something about Marcus's voice lingered. The weight of it. The longing. It wasn't simply a man searching for a missing animal. It was someone searching for a part of himself he'd buried long ago. That afternoon, Ethan checked on the mare again. She lifted her head when he approached, recognition simmering in her tired eyes. She drank more water than the day before, and when he brushed her neck, she leaned slightly into his hand. Her trust was small, but it was there. A fragile bridge built board by board. You've got someone coming for you, he said quietly. Not the wrong someone. Maybe the right one. She blinked, slow and soft. Ethan spent the rest of the day repairing the old guest room, dusting shelves, tightening window frames, clearing a path through boxes that had been untouched for years. There was no reason to prepare so carefully for a stranger. And yet somehow, it felt necessary, as though Marcus Fielding's arrival was not merely a visit, but a turning point. A hinge swinging open. Night settled deep and cold across the plains. The mare slept in her stall, her breaths deeper now, no longer trembling with every inhale. Ethan stayed awake longer than usual, listening for the crunch of tires over gravel. It came just past midnight. Headlights crept slowly up the long drive, casting thin beams over the frost that clung to the fences. A truck rolled to a stop beside the barn. A man stepped out. Tall, shoulders slightly hunched. Movements careful, like someone carrying something breakable inside himself. Marcus Fielding. Ethan opened the door before Marcus reached the porch. They didn't shake hands. They simply nodded. Two men acknowledging a moment that felt larger than either of them. "Where is she?" Marcus asked. "In the barn," Ethan said. They walked side by side, boots crunching softly in the frost. Neither spoke. Words would have only narrowed the width of everything Marcus was feeling. When they reached the stall, the mare stirred. Her ears twitched, then lifted. A soft sound, a breath, almost a hum, escaped her. Marcus froze. Ethan watched his chest rise, fall, then seize with something that looked like disbelief. "Echo," Marcus whispered. The mare lifted her head higher. Marcus stepped forward, slowly, reverently, like a man approaching the last piece of a world he thought he'd lost forever. He rested his hands on the stall door, and in that quiet, aching space, Echo took one unsteady step toward him. The moment Marcus stepped into the barn, the air shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable to Ethan, who had grown used to the way silence behaved inside these walls. Echo, who had been resting with her head lowered, lifted it with a sudden alertness that seemed to bypass exhaustion. Her ears pricked forward, her breath catching in a tight, trembling pause. She looked at Marcus as if she were recognizing the shape of a memory she hadn't dared believe could return. Marcus stopped 3 feet from the stall. For a long time, he didn't move. His hands hovered above the wooden rail, unsure whether to grip it or retreat. His shoulders, stiff from hours of driving, rose with each breath and then tensed, as if bracing for the impact of something he had dreamed of but never expected to survive. "She remembers," Ethan murmured quietly, but Marcus didn't seem to hear him. His eyes glistened with the fragile shine of someone caught between joy and grief, between hope and fear, between the past that broke him and the present that asked him to face it again. "Echo," he whispered. The name never made it past the threshold of the stall before the mare moved. Her step was small, barely more than a shift of weight, but it carried the weight of 12 years across the space between them. Her breath fogged the cold air, the plume trembling as though her entire body was leaning into it. She stretched her neck forward, nostrils flaring softly, tasting the scent she had once known as home. Marcus pressed a hand to his mouth, trying to steady himself. The sound that escaped him wasn't a word, nor a sob, just a breath collapsing under the gravity of memory. He stepped closer, resting his palms on the worn wooden rail. Slowly, as if afraid he'd break whatever delicate miracle was forming, he extended a trembling hand. Echo touched her muzzle to his fingers. The contact was feather-light, but it broke Marcus. He bowed his head, shoulders shaking as 12 years of guilt, loss, and buried tenderness rose to the surface. Echo breathed against him, a gentle huff that warmed the chill of the barn. She leaned her head into his palm, her eyes half closing, not from exhaustion, but from something like peace. "She knows you," Ethan said softly. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing through the emotion that tightened his chest. Then he opened the stall gate with a careful motion, as if reverence itself guided his hands. Echo didn't retreat. She stepped toward him, leaning her forehead lightly into his chest. He rested his cheek against her neck, fingers sinking into the rough strands of her mane. "I thought you were gone," he whispered, voice raw, scraping from a place deep inside. "I thought I'd failed you too." Echo exhaled into his coat, a soft, rumbling sigh. Ethan watched the two of them from a few steps back. Man and horse. Grief and forgiveness. Past and present. Woven together in a silence that didn't need filling. Marcus stayed like that for a long time, letting Echo's breath steady his own. Only when she shifted her stance, adjusting her weight, did he pull back enough to look at her properly. His eyes moved over the outline of her ribs, the hollows in her cheeks, the way her coat lacked its former shine. "What did they do to you?" he asked, voice barely audible. Ethan stepped forward. "We don't know yet, but she's fighting." Marcus nodded without turning around. "She always was." He traced his fingers along Echo's cheekbone, then brushed her, tangled forelock from her eyes. The symbol on her neck remained hidden beneath the heavy mane, but its presence seemed to pulse through the air like an unspoken demand. "When I lost my sister," Marcus said slowly, "I thought losing Echo was just fate. Bad luck. Part of the storm." His throat tightened. "But now that I'm standing here, looking at her, I know better. That mark wasn't fate. Someone did this." Ethan didn't respond. Not yet. Marcus needed to say it, needed to release it. Marcus took another breath, steadier this time. "I spent years trying to forget everything about the arena. The trophies, the training schedules, the way my sister laughed when Echo would steal apples from her pockets. I thought if I buried it deep enough, maybe the ache would stop." He glanced down at Echo, who nudged his chest gently, as if reminding him she was there. "But you can't bury love. It comes back, even broken." Ethan leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed loosely, but eyes attentive. "What happened the night she vanished?" he asked quietly. Marcus closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his palms against his forehead, as if steadying the memory before it consumed him. When he lowered his hands, his voice had grown heavier, slower. "I came home after the funeral," he began. "The arena was empty. My parents were hollow shells. The horses, they were all we had left of her. Echo most of all. But 2 nights before the auction, she was gone." His voice cracked. Vanished. No broken fences, no stray gates. Just gone. Ethan didn't interrupt. "The sheriff said she got spooked and ran, or that a drifter took her, but I knew Echo. She wouldn't walk away. Not from us." Marcus straightened, though his hands remained on Echo's neck. "I told people someone took her. No one believed me. They thought I was grieving, delusional. The place was closing anyway. They said the horses weren't worth fighting over." Ethan felt anger flash through him, not at Marcus, but at the people who'd dismissed him so easily. People who didn't understand what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. Marcus exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I thought I'd failed her, failed my sister, failed everything that mattered." He swallowed. "But she came back. After all these years, she still found someone who'd care." Ethan lowered his gaze. He wasn't used to being spoken of that way. He wasn't used to being someone's lifeline. Not anymore. "You're here now," Ethan said quietly. "And so is she. That counts for something." Marcus let his hand slide slowly down Echo's neck, stopping when his fingers brushed the slight rise of the symbol beneath her mane. He parted the tangled strands and stared at it. His jaw clenched. "That wasn't there before," he whispered. "Whoever took her, they claimed her." Ethan stepped forward. "Dr. Rowan said it wasn't a ranch brand. More like a crest, something personal." Marcus nodded, eyes burning. "Trevor." The name landed between them like a dropped hammer. Trevor Marks, Marcus continued, bitterness sharp in his voice. He trained for us. My sister thought he was brilliant. I thought he was a parasite. Always talking about legacy and bloodlines. Always pushing my sister to let him train Echo properly. Marcus's voice roughened. He offered to buy Echo after she died. I told him no. I told him never to come back. Ethan felt the rest of the story forming in the space between them. And 2 weeks later, Marcus whispered, she disappeared. Echo shifted closer, leaning her head against his shoulder. Marcus closed his eyes. You found your way back, he murmured into her mane. I don't know how, or why, but you did. Ethan watched them quietly. The truth would unravel piece by piece, like threads pulled from an old frayed blanket. But for now, in this dim barn lit by a single lantern, what mattered was simple. Echo was no longer lost. Marcus was no longer alone. And Ethan was no longer just a bystander to a stranger's grief. He stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Echo's shoulder beside Marcus's. We'll figure out the rest, Ethan said. Together. Marcus nodded, wiping a sleeve across his eyes. Together, he echoed. Echo breathed deeply, her breath warm against both men, settling the dust in the air, as if sealing a promise neither of them fully understood yet, but both were willing to honor. The storm that had hovered over the plains for 2 days finally drifted east, leaving behind a washed-out quiet that clung to the world like a damp blanket. By morning, the sky was a pale, bruise-colored blue. Ethan stepped out of the house with 2 mugs of coffee, one for himself, one for Marcus, and found the man already standing near the barn, shoulders hunched against the cold, eyes fixed on the doorway as if Echo might vanish if he looked away. She made it through the night, Ethan said, handing him the coffee. Marcus nodded, but didn't take his eyes off the barn. I didn't expect her to remember me, he admitted, voice low. But I wasn't prepared for that. Ethan understood. The way Echo had leaned into Marcus the night before hadn't been instinct. It had been recognition. The kind that didn't fade with time. The kind that broke open whatever walls a man built around his grief. She's stronger this morning, Ethan said. Drank more, moved around a little. Marcus finally took a sip of coffee, but the warmth didn't reach his face. Something else weighed on him. Something that hadn't surfaced during the reunion. Ethan waited, knowing silence sometimes coaxed truths better than questions. It worked. Trevor Marks, Marcus said finally. You asked who might have branded her. Ethan turned, listening. He was the last person to see Echo before she disappeared, Marcus continued. My parents trusted him. My sister trusted him. I didn't. There was something about him. His voice trailed off, searching for the right word. Ambitious. Too ambitious. Echo was talented, more than any of our horses, and talent attracts the wrong kind of people. They walked toward the barn together. The morning light fell across the ranch, revealing long shadows and frost that glittered like broken glass. The quiet stretched between them until Marcus exhaled sharply. He came to the arena 2 weeks after my sister died, Marcus said. Told my father he wanted to buy Echo. He said she deserved a real career, that she'd go nowhere if she stayed with a grieving family. His hands tightened around the coffee mug. Dad threw him off the property, told him to never come back. And then Echo vanished, Ethan murmured. Marcus nodded. 2 nights later, gates locked, fences intact, no broken boards. Someone let her out, quiet as a shadow. He swallowed. I told the sheriff it was Trevor. But grief turns people into myths, Ethan. They thought I was seeing ghosts. Ethan pushed open the barn door. Echo lifted her head from the straw, ears twitching at the familiar sound. Marcus stepped toward her with a reverence that was almost painful to witness. "She looks a little better today," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "Stronger." Ethan watched the mare's breathing. Steadier. Deeper. More sure. Her eyes held a new brightness, the dull glaze fading little by little. Survival had given way to something gentler, something like trust. As Marcus stroked her neck, his fingers brushed the symbol hidden beneath her mane. He parted the strands and stared at the mark again, the crescent intersected by two angled lines, raw, brutal, claiming. "This wasn't done by someone who cared for her," Marcus said. "No," Ethan agreed. "This was someone marking what they thought belonged to them." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. His hand hovered above the mark as if touching it might bring back the moment it was burned into her skin. "He used to talk about legacy," Marcus whispered. "Bloodlines. Prestige. He believed Echo was wasted with us. He said she was born for more." Ethan leaned against the stall door. "Some people hide cruelty behind ambition." Marcus nodded, jaw tightening. "I tried to forget him. After my sister died, everything hurt. The arena shutting down, the horses leaving, my parents falling apart. And Trevor? He just slipped out of the story." His voice faltered. "I didn't want to think that someone could take the last piece of her from us, but he did." Echo shifted her weight and nudged Marcus's shoulder, a soft gesture that seemed to steady him more than any words could. Marcus smiled weakly and rested his cheek against her neck. "You survived," he whispered. "After everything, you made it." Ethan stepped forward, checking Echo's legs, inspecting her hooves again. "When Dr. Rowan comes back," he said, "we'll start treating her for parasites, and I'll need a farrier to work on her hooves. They've been neglected too long." Marcus watched him, something unreadable behind his eyes. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked quietly. "For Echo?" Ethan paused. The question wasn't confrontational. It was genuine, a small window into a man trying to understand kindness after years of disappointment. "Because someone should," Ethan answered simply, "and because she fought her way here. That alone deserves help." Marcus nodded, as though filing the answer somewhere deep inside. "You're a good man, Ethan." Ethan didn't reply. Compliments always sat strangely on him. When Rowan arrived that afternoon, she examined Echo with a more optimistic air. "She's responding better than I expected," she said. "Keep doing what you're doing. And whatever happened to her before, it's behind her now." But Marcus shook his head. "Not behind, just buried." Rowan raised a brow but didn't press. Some mysteries weren't meant for strangers. After she left, Ethan and Marcus walked the pasture fence together. Snow cracked beneath their boots. The horizon stretched wide and silent, the kind of silence that held stories rather than emptiness. "She didn't get this far on her own," Marcus said. "Wyoming isn't exactly a short walk from Colorado." "No," Ethan agreed, "but someone must have abandoned her nearby." Marcus's expression darkened. "Trevor." "You don't know that for sure?" "No," Marcus said, "but I know the pattern. Men like him don't care what happens when the horse stops making money." Ethan leaned on the fence rail. The wind tugged at his jacket, cold and thin. "What do you want to do?" Marcus stared across the plains, jaw set, eyes narrowed as though the truth were somewhere in the distance. "I want to know what she's been through. I want to know where she's been." His voice broke, just slightly. "And I want to know why she came here." Ethan didn't answer. Because the truth, whether mystical or practical, was simple. Echo had come here because she had nowhere else left to go. And because something, pain, memory, instinct, had carried her across miles of empty country toward the only person willing to listen. As the sun dipped low, turning the fields to gold, Marcus spoke again, softly, like someone confessing the final piece of a long-hidden truth. "I never got to say goodbye to my sister," he said. "But maybe this is my chance to set something right." Echo called softly from the barn, a gentle, low sound that rolled across the cold air like a promise. Ethan felt it too, that sense that something had begun the moment he found her in the snow, something larger than loss, larger than the storm that brought her, a story resurfacing, a truth that refused to stay buried. And the cracks in that truth, illuminated by winter light, were starting to widen. Morning arrived gently, the kind of Wyoming morning that didn't announce itself with dramatic skies, but with a thin layer of warmth sneaking into the cold, as if spring were sending advance scouts long before its true arrival. Ethan stood at the barn door, watching dust drift lazily through a sliver of sunlight. The light fell across Echo's stall, softening the harsh edges of everything she had endured. The mare lifted her head, not in fear this time, not in startled instinct, but in quiet acknowledgement, as though the world weighed a little less today. Marcus was already inside the stall with her, kneeling beside her shoulder as he adjusted the blanket. He moved with a tenderness Ethan recognized immediately, not the tenderness of someone trying to earn trust, but the tenderness of someone who'd carried love for far too long without a place to set it down. "She ate more this morning," Marcus said without looking up. "Not much, but she's trying." Ethan nodded, stepping in closer. "Trying counts for a lot." Echo shifted her weight, leaning slightly toward Marcus's touch. Her eyes had lost some of the hollow darkness that had consumed them the first night. They weren't bright, not yet, but they were aware, anchored, like someone waking from a long sleep. Marcus reached to brush a strand of mane from her eyes. "She looks more like herself today," he murmured. "Still not the horse she once was, but she's coming back." Ethan watched the way Echo leaned into the motion. "She trusts you. That helps." But Marcus shook his head. "She trusts you too, more than I expected." His voice softened. "You were the first good thing she saw when she came out of whatever life she escaped." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know how to hold compliments. Instead, he crouched beside Echo and let her sniff his hand. She pressed her muzzle gently into his palm. Just a brief touch, but purposeful. Ethan felt it travel through him like a warm current, settling somewhere deep he hadn't realized was still cold. "That's new," he said softly. "Didn't do that yesterday." Marcus smiled faintly. "She's choosing you." The words, simple as they were, landed heavier than Ethan expected. He wasn't used to being chosen by anything except hard work and bad weather. But this creature who had wandered into his life half dead, had decided he was safe. Worth leaning toward. Outside, the wind shifted, softened, as if the plains themselves were exhaling. They worked together throughout the morning, cleaning Echo's stall, brushing out her tangled mane, applying a mild salve to her cracked hooves. Ethan taught Marcus how he'd been preparing water with electrolytes. Marcus taught Ethan how Echo used to respond to quiet whistles, how she loved being spoken to, even if she didn't understand the words. New stories slipped through their conversations like threads weaving two lives together. "I never thought I'd see her again," Marcus said at one point, his voice low. "Every year that passed, the hope got smaller. But it never died. It just hid." Echo nudged his shoulder as though grounding him. "You think she remembers?" Ethan asked. "Not everything," Marcus said. "But she remembers enough. Horses don't forget kindness, or fear, or voices that once meant safety." Ethan studied the mare's eyes, no longer empty, but carrying a flicker of something fragile and steady. "She's remembering how to live," he said. The rest of the day unfolded with the slow rhythm of healing. Marcus stayed by Echo's side, telling her stories he hadn't said aloud in years. Stories about his sister, about competitions at Echo Ridge, about the way Echo had once chased butterflies like they were rivals to outrun. Ethan pretended to busy himself around the barn, fixing tools and sweeping straw, but he heard every word. And he saw the way those stories softened the tightness in Marcus's shoulders, as if speaking them unburied something that had been frozen inside him since the day Echo vanished. Later, when the sun slanted low across the pasture, Echo took a few tentative steps toward the open part of the stall. Marcus held his breath. "Easy," he said. "Don't rush. Go slow." Echo paused, steadying herself. Then she walked, unsteadily but freely, 3 steps forward before resting again. Ethan felt unexpected pride rise in his chest. Those 3 steps carried more triumph than any race or trophy. 3 steps toward recovery. 3 steps toward reclaiming a life that had been stolen. "She's getting herself back," Marcus whispered. "She is," Ethan agreed. "One step at a time." As dusk settled across the ranch, turning the fields a muted copper, Marcus and Ethan walked outside to watch the horizon shift colors. Neither spoke for a long while. The silence felt different now, less heavy, more peaceful. Echo's soft movements inside her stall blended with the wind brushing over the grass, creating a quiet symphony that belonged only to the 3 of them. After a time, Marcus said, "You know, if she hadn't found you, she wouldn't have made it. You saved her." Ethan didn't turn his head. "She saved herself. I just opened a door she could walk through." Marcus looked down at his boots. "You don't give yourself much credit, do you?" Ethan shrugged. "Doesn't change the truth." But the truth, Marcus realized, was bigger than either of them had shaped it so far. Echo hadn't stumbled onto this ranch by chance. She had followed something, instinct or memory or something deeper, something unspoken, until she reached a man who still believed in doing right, even when no one was watching. Night deepened, leaving only the barn lantern glowing like a warm ember in the dark. Marcus lingered at the doorway, watching Echo settle into the straw. Ethan stood beside him, arms crossed loosely, not in tension, but in thought. "She's getting stronger," Marcus said. "And so are you," Ethan replied quietly. Marcus blinked, startled. Then he smiled, a gentle, worn smile that carried more sincerity than pride. "Maybe," he said. Ethan nodded. "Healing isn't only for horses." Inside the barn, Echo lifted her head, listening to their voices. Then she exhaled, a soft, steady breath that filled the stall like a promise. Tomorrow she would walk farther. Tomorrow she would eat a little more. Tomorrow the truth would move closer to revealing itself. But for tonight, healing was enough. And as the lantern flickered behind them, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not comfort, but the first subtle trace of hope curling warm in his chest. The morning after Echo's first real steps felt different. Not warmer, not brighter, but quieter in a way that suggested something inside the barn had shifted. Ethan noticed it the moment he stepped outside. The wind, usually restless across the Wyoming plains, seemed to hold its breath. The frost on the grass glimmered without its usual sharpness, as if softened by the knowledge that something fragile had survived another night. Marcus was already awake, standing by the fence with his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. His posture was rigid, but his gaze was distant, fixed on a point far beyond the pasture, somewhere deep in the past. Ethan walked toward him, boots crunching softly. Marcus didn't turn, but he didn't need to. He recognized the footsteps instantly. "She slept," Marcus said quietly. Really slept. Not the restless breathing she had before. Ethan nodded. "She's healing." "Yeah," Marcus whispered, but the word sounded weighted, half hope, half ache. They went inside the barn together. Echo greeted them with a soft rumble, lifting her head and taking a step toward the gate with noticeably more certainty than the day before. Her coat still held the dullness of long neglect, but the light in her eyes had sharpened, gaining a clarity that made Ethan pause. It reminded him of a horse with a purpose. A horse that had not come here to die, but to reach someone. Marcus approached her slowly. She met him halfway. "Hey, girl," he whispered. "Still fighting, huh?" Echo pressed her nose into his chest. Ethan watched the exchange silently, sensing, but not fully understanding, that something important was unfolding. Not just a reunion, not just healing, but a decision forming in the quiet space between man and horse. Marcus lingered by Echo's side, brushing a hand gently along her cheek. Ethan saw his fingers tremble, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that reached past the years and the miles and the losses. When Echo turned her head and rested it against Marcus's shoulder, he inhaled sharply, his throat tightening. "She trusts you," Ethan said. Marcus nodded, still stroking her. "She always did. She trusted all of us, even when we didn't deserve it." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't have to. Echo Ridge. The collapse. The grief that swallowed entire families. The way animals often carried burdens they didn't understand. Ethan could feel the pieces without hearing them spoken. They worked in silence for a while, cleaning the stall, adding fresh straw, preparing Echo's measured meals. When they led her outdoors for a few minutes to feel the sunlight, Marcus stayed close, almost as if afraid she might disappear again. Echo leaned toward him with each step. "She's bonded to you," Ethan observed. Marcus didn't respond at first. He watched her breathe in the cold morning air, watched her blink softly as light touched her face. Then he sighed. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you." Ethan waited. Marcus took a long, steadying breath. "I can't take her." Ethan didn't react, not outwardly, but inside, something tightened. "What do you mean?" Marcus kept his eyes on Echo as he spoke. "I came here ready to bring her back with me, ready to finish whatever story we started. But look at her. Look at how she watches you." Echo had turned her head toward Ethan, ears flicking lightly at the sound of his voice. She took a small step in his direction, slow, careful, but intentional. Ethan felt it in his chest, a warm pulse of recognition. "She survived things I can't even imagine," Marcus continued. "Years of it, alone. And somehow, she made her way here. To you. Not to Colorado. Not to me. His voice cracked. To you. Ethan crossed his arms loosely, leaning against the fence. You're her family. Marcus shook his head. I was, once. But family isn't just history. It's presence. It's who shows up at the end of the storm. His eyes softened as he watched Echo nuzzle Ethan's sleeve. She chose you, Ethan. The way she used to choose my sister. The way some horses decide who they belong to. Ethan exhaled slowly, the responsibility settling on him like fresh snow. Quiet. Inevitable. She still needs you, he said gently. Marcus smiled, though the sadness never left his eyes. Maybe. But need isn't the same as belong. They walked Echo slowly back into the barn. The mare moved with more steadiness than she'd shown in days, her breathing even, her ears relaxed. Marcus stood at the stall door for a long moment before speaking again. I've spent years trying to hold on to what I lost, he said. My sister, the arena, Echo. But holding on isn't the same as honoring. He swallowed. Honoring means doing what's best, even if it breaks your heart. Ethan looked at him, sensing the weight of the moment. What are you trying to say, Marcus? Marcus placed a hand on Echo's neck, letting her warmth seep into his palm. I want you to keep her. The words landed in the air like snowflakes, soft, simple, but carrying the full weight of winter. Marcus, Ethan began, but Marcus shook his head. No. Listen. You saved her. You saw her when most people would have walked past. You gave her water, warmth, a chance. And she trusts you more than she's trusted anyone since my sister. His voice thickened, but he didn't look away. I can't take her from the one place she finally feels safe. Echo blinked gently, nudging his shoulder as though to soothe him. Marcus let out a shaky breath. I'll help, he whispered. With expenses, with anything you need. I'll visit when I can. But she belongs here. With you. Ethan didn't speak for a long time. He looked at Echo, her fragile but determined stance, the way she leaned toward warmth, the quiet strength returning to her eyes. She had come to him half dead, carrying stories written in scars. She had walked through storms and miles and darkness to reach this barn. Do you think she knows? Ethan asked softly. Marcus nodded, brushing Echo's cheek one last time. Horses know where they're meant to be long before we do. The barn fell into a hush that felt sacred. Echo breathed out, a steady, warm exhale that brushed Ethan's shoulder. Marcus stepped back, his hand lingering in the air as if reluctant to break the connection. Then he looked at Ethan with a mixture of gratitude and grief. I'm not losing her again, he said. Not this time. I'm letting her live. Ethan placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder. She'll be safe here. I know. Marcus's voice softened. That's why I'm doing this. Echo rested her head on Ethan's arm, trusting, unafraid. And in that quiet, trembling moment, 3 broken stories, the mares, the brothers, the ranchers, aligned for the first time. Not perfectly, not neatly, but truthfully. Sometimes belonging wasn't about the past. Sometimes it was about where a wounded heart finally stopped running. Spring did not arrive all at once on the Wyoming plains. It came quietly, the way healing often did, through small signs most people overlooked. A hint of warmth in the morning breeze, snow melting in thin lines along the fence posts, the first stubborn blades of green pushing through frost-burned ground. But Ethan noticed it, not because he was waiting for spring, but because Echo seemed to feel it before he did. Each day, she walked a little farther. Her steps lost their tremble. Her eyes, once hollow and dim, grew clearer, like someone slowly turning up the brightness on a faded photograph. Her coat, still dull in places, caught more sunlight as the days passed. And when she lifted her head toward the hills, ears forward, Ethan could swear he saw recognition, not of the land, but of the idea of life again. Marcus visited often at first, staying through the cold mornings and early evenings, helping Ethan with feedings, brushing out Echo's coat, learning the rhythm of her new home. But as Echo grew stronger, Marcus's visits grew quieter, gentler, less like a man reclaiming a lost past, and more like someone letting go the right way. The burden he carried didn't vanish, but it softened around the edges, becoming something he could hold rather than something that held him. "You were right," Marcus said one afternoon, as Echo walked freely in the corral, her steps light, almost youthful. "She belongs here. And I think I needed to see her safe more than I needed her to come back with me." Ethan leaned on the fence beside him. "She's part of your story." "She is," Marcus agreed. "But she's also part of yours now." Echo snorted softly and trotted a small, clumsy circle. Nothing like the athletic displays she once performed, but enough to make Marcus smile. "She's showing off," he said. "She used to do that for my sister. Wouldn't do it for anyone else." Ethan chuckled. "Guess she's warming up to me." "Guess she already has," Marcus replied. That evening, when Marcus drove away, he did so without the hesitation he'd arrived with. A chapter of his life, one that had been left open too long, was finally able to close without bitterness. And Echo watched his truck until the dust settled, then turned back toward Ethan with the calm acceptance of someone who understood the difference between goodbye and abandonment. As spring deepened, Ethan began repairing the unused barn extension. It had once been a training area built by the ranch's previous owner, but abandoned long before Ethan ever set foot on the land. He cleared out old tools, replaced rotten boards, opened wide the doors to let sunlight wash away the stale air. When he finished, the space felt open again, clean, simple, and full of possibility. It was then that the idea came to him. There was a group home in town for children who had been through things most adults struggled to understand. Loss, instability, the slow ache of feeling unwanted. Ethan had repaired their tack room the year before, and a few of the kids had lingered around him, curious, quiet, watching him work with a mix of caution and hope. Echo would understand them, he thought, and they would understand her. The first time he brought the idea to Marcus, the man nodded immediately. "She was always gentle with kids," he said. "She knew when someone needed calm more than anything else." So Ethan called the home's director. Arrangements were made. And on the first warm day of the season, a van pulled up to the ranch with 6 children and 2 staff members. They stepped out hesitantly, some excited, some anxious, and some holding themselves the way Echo had when Ethan first found her, braced for disappointment. Ethan guided them to the barn. Echo stood near the open stall, her ears tilted forward in curiosity. She wasn't nervous, just observant, the way horses often were when trying to measure the weight of new hearts entering their space. "This is Echo," Ethan said. The children approached slowly. The smallest girl, maybe 8 years old, held back. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves, shoulders drawn up as though she expected the world to prove itself unkind. Ethan knelt beside her. "She won't hurt you," he said gently. "She knows what it's like to be scared." The girl didn't answer, but her eyes flicked toward Echo. So Ethan stood quietly and waited, giving her space, the same way he had with Echo. After a long moment, the girl took one tiny step forward. Echo lowered her head, breath soft as a sigh. She didn't lean in, didn't crowd the girl, just waited, still and warm, offering presence without expectation. The girl lifted her hand slowly, trembling, until her fingers brushed Echo's muzzle. The mare closed her eyes, leaning gently into the touch. The girl let out a breath that shuddered and softened at the same time. For a fleeting moment, she smiled. Ethan felt something loosen inside him. Not pride exactly, not joy, but a quiet assurance that this moment mattered, that Echo's journey had led her here for reasons none of them could have predicted. Throughout the afternoon, the children brushed Echo's coat, fed her small apple slices, and learned how to guide her with simple touch cues. Echo, for her part, moved with remarkable patience, adjusting her weight and posture so the smallest among them could reach her. When one boy stumbled while holding her lead rope, Echo stopped immediately, lowering her head to check on him. "She's protecting him," one of the staff whispered in awe. Ethan nodded. "She's good at knowing what people need." As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of soft pink and gold, the children lined up to say goodbye. Echo watched them leave, ears turning toward their voices until the van pulled out of sight. Then she turned inward, walking closer to Ethan with a quiet familiarity that had grown stronger each day. "You did good today," he murmured, stroking her neck. "Better than I ever could have asked." Echo leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. Just a second, just long enough to remind him that trust was not a gift she gave lightly. Over the next weeks, the visits continued. The children grew bolder, Echo grew stronger, and Ethan, without planning to, began to see his ranch transform. The empty spaces of his life slowly filled with something gentler, something healing. One evening, as Echo grazed near the hill overlooking the property, Marcus returned for a short visit. He stood beside Ethan, hands in his pockets, watching her. "She looks whole again," Marcus said. Ethan nodded. "She is." Marcus's gaze softened. "And so are you." Ethan didn't reply, but he didn't need to. Echo lifted her head, the breeze catching strands of her mane as she walked toward them. Steady, confident, alive. She stopped between them, nudging Ethan's arm, then pressing her cheek briefly into Marcus's coat, acknowledging him, thanking him, closing the circle. A once lost horse, a once broken brother, a once lonely rancher. 3 stories crossing paths beneath an open sky. Ethan placed a hand on Echo's neck as the sun dipped behind the hills. "You're home," he whispered. And Echo exhaled. Slow, warm, at peace. A breath that didn't tremble. A breath that carried no fear. A breath that promised spring had truly come. If Echo's journey touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share a memory, a feeling, or even just a hello in the comments. Your words help keep stories like hers alive. And if you'd like to join us for the next story of courage, hope, and second chances, make sure to subscribe. There's always another heart waiting to be heard.